type 2 diabetes in South Trinidad. So I looked at the use of folk medicine, traditional medicine, and the use of food and diet as a means of managing type 2 diabetes. And that was a really intensive qualitative project where I interviewed over 20, it was over 20 participants. I recently finished up a work term at the Ottawa Hospital where I worked with the Bridge Engagement Center. So that's a community-based participatory action research center looking at the experiences of low income and homeless folks in the area. So I did a COVID project with them as well. It was in part interviews and in part a really intensive survey. And right now, I am the quarantine implementation coordinator for York University. So I'm working very closely with international students who are looking to return back to Canada after a bit of a quarantining process in their home countries. So I work closely with student wellness, international student services, and also the provincial. I have to keep a really close eye on the provincial and federal mandates for travel and everything. So that's what I'm doing right now. And you know what, through how I answer these questions, I'll get into a little bit more of my research, but that's it for me right now.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. It's interesting to see how your research has changed since the pandemic has started. All right,
yeah,
and then,
kidding.
Right? It's really interesting to see, like, it's something unexpected, but it brings about new results. All right, and then Sarah, do you want to do a quick introduction?
Sure. Yeah, I just finished my master's in public health and health systems at UW, and so my research was in rural Honduras. I was looking at livelihood opportunities for young people, as many of you have heard much about. And before that, I worked for a year in India. I was working with a non-governmental organization, and that was after I had done my bachelor's degree at the University of Guelph in agriculture and international development. So yeah, right now I am working with Dr. Dodd. Still, I'm doing some follow-up research from my master's, and I'm prepping to move to Guatemala. I'm going to be working with a non-governmental organization doing program monitoring and evaluation for the next 3 years.
Wow.
Starting this summer, yeah.
That's exciting.
It is.
Congratulations. Hopefully,
Thanks.
Fingers crossed, knock on wood, the pandemic slows down and sort of like decreases to a minimum by
hopefully
then.
I won't just move to Guatemala City and then like stay in my apartment all the time.
Yeah, see the beautiful city around, enjoy it. All right, and since Layla and Shoshana, you guys didn't really prepare anything, you guys don't have to go into that. You guys are here as participants. So without further ado, we'll jump into the very first question, and that is, how do you see colonialism affecting the field you perform research in? And have you observed any of these effects during your research career? So I'll just go by who's above and who's below right here. So Chantal, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. So the biggest way that I see colonialism in the field of global health and more broadly public health research is first and foremost the institutions that allow research to happen. So by this, I mean a lot of us as students work in the university context, and even my former job at the Ottawa Hospital. Now I have to acknowledge that individual researchers who are committed to sort of undoing the harms of colonialism have done some really great work in that, whether or not it be the methods or theories that they use, or even like on the ground, their interactions with participants. However, there is something to be said for the fact that in order for decolonizing to happen, it is generally happening in these spaces that have been created through a colonialist process. So I think from there, it really shows the importance of having to acknowledge the systemic factors that sort of infiltrate like the academy and health spaces. And inherently, it does affect the type of research that goes on, whether we want to admit it or not. I find that in global health research, and I think this has to do with the demographic of people that are interested in global health research and the diversity. I think more people are willing to identify and like engage in the fact that there is a problematic history of global health research that is informed by colonialism. However, I find that within the broader umbrella of global health research, because we have anthropologists, we have sociologists, we have ethnographers, we have stats and data people, we have epidemiologists. Within those sort of subsects of what is global health, you see different sort of levels of how people are committed to identifying and addressing sort of like the impacts of colonialism. For example, I come from a background in anthropology. My master's was in public issues anthropology at the University of Guelph. And from there, I learned a lot about critical race theory, intersectionality, and feminist lenses. However, transitioning to a public health and global health space, I found that these are theories and ideas that aren't necessarily, I wouldn't say accepted, but they are not as inherent towards the research. And it makes me feel like more of a novel person within the global health field, having a background in sociology and anthropology. And it was a bit of a shock at first, but then once you kind of situate yourself as a type of researcher within the larger umbrella of global health research, you understand why. So that's how I see it affecting, that's how I see colonial affecting research in a broad sense. And that's sort of how I see myself and position myself. I, coming from a background in anthropology, have a more critical lens at these things. And I see it more from the more biomedical lens that has sort of informed what public health research is and what global health research is.
Yeah, thank you. I think a lot of those points Dr. Rondu also touched upon in her previous keynote, so that was wonderful that you talked about it. And Sarah, I'll pass it on to you now to answer the question.
Sure. Also, there's some groovy tunes going on in my basement, so I don't know if you can hear those, but
okay. I have a vacuum going, so that's better than mine.
So I was actually thinking about this question more specifically in the context of my own research. Although, Chantal, what you were saying, I had also been thinking about sort of the other day when I was prepping for this, just the nature of how the field of global health developed. So I did part of my undergrad in international development, and I felt like all we talked about was colonialism. That was like, it was a huge part of that program was, you know, like, how did development come to be and where is this coming from? And so much of that is rooted in like anthropology and sociology and that type of research that's happened in the past. And I wondered about global health, and maybe some people know more about like global health history than I do, because I kind of came from outside the field, but I wondered about that in terms of like where it's developing out of, and you know, like if it's coming out of health studies and then kind of being merged with things like social sciences. I felt like even at UW, I feel like the global health program or the global health like aspects of the department are like still sort of emerging, and so some of these issues and some of these topics are coming up as like, oh yeah, we need to grapple with this too. So I was kind of thinking about how those fields have maybe developed differently over time and how that plays out. But in terms of my own research, so I don't know if I mentioned earlier, but like my research interests are in agricultural development and livelihood sustainability, specifically among smallholder and subsistence farmers. And so I did my master's research in Central America. And if you are learning about Central American history, Central America was colonized by Spain. And so you can actually, like, you can see this very clearly, that descendants of colonists tend to be living in the plains while indigenous communities were sort of pushed up into the mountains. And so many of the people in these communities are subsistence farmers, but they're working then on marginal land, and they're growing crops on slopes. They're having issues with erosion and so on and so forth. And so when I think of like, sort of like the colonial legacy in these contexts, that's the type of thing that I think of and see very clearly in my work. And you see that kind of pattern sort of all over the world when it comes to distribution of agricultural land, that colonizers and their descendants ended up owning the best land, while locals and Indigenous communities ended up sort of with the leftovers. We see that with Indigenous groups in Canada. I saw that with what they call the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes in rural parts of India, and then again in Central America during my master's. So yeah, that's one way that I see that very clearly in my own work. Another thing for me is funding flows, so north-south funding flows, and that's a big reason why I sort of like ended up going in the direction that I did with my work. So like, yeah, funding is like an ever-present issue. It's really challenging to navigate. And a lot of the work that I've ended up doing has been sort of being a bridge between institutions in the global north and the global south. So yeah, it sort of started when I was working in India, that I was sort of writing project proposals and writing evaluation reports for the organization that I was working with. So I guess I see it as like having lived and worked in a setting in the global south and taking time to understand the work that a non-governmental organization is doing in that setting, and then communicating that to an audience in the global north, where there's a funding agency or an academic community or donors that are supporting this work in various ways. So yeah, I mean, that's just a very obvious sort of remnant of those patterns and systems that have to be navigated, that are being navigated in the context of the type of work that I'm doing.
Yeah, that's wonderful. That's an interesting sort of like seat you take, because you talked about how you're being the bridge between the global north and the global south, so that you get a sort of perspective of like where there may be some conflict between the goals of the two. So that's kind of interesting.
Yeah, definitely.
And it seems like a lot of these things that you guys talked about are rooted in more like, I guess more social opinions and social biases that have persisted from a long time ago. Like Sara, you mentioned how in Honduras, I believe you said that there was split between where the indigenous population went into the mountains, and then the Spanish, you said, the Spanish took over the plains. So that's something that's like rooted in history. So there's a lot of stuff that I feel we need to unravel for decolonization to happen in the field of global health. So thank you for that. I think I'll move on to the next question. And I think you guys sort of touched a little bit on this, so this makes it into a good segue. What are some methods that you use to ensure that you are performing ethical research? Do you have any formal training in these methods, or was it a learn as you go sort of process? And Chantal, I'll pass it on to you.
Yeah, so I have like two parts to this question. So one, in terms of like the sort of academic side of it, I kind of prepared this for like an academic audience because we're all students and everything. So one way, and like the sort of entryway in order to ensure that you're performing ethical research, is to ensure that you're taking courses on methods and ensure that you are communicating with your university ethics board. That is required for all students. And I think that there is something to be said for like a regulatory process there. Is it perfect? No. But does it ensure that there is some semblance of like, I guess, decorum in the process? Yes. So I'm very conflicted on things like this, and I'll give you an example too. When I was doing my ethics submission at the University of Guelph, like ethics at Guelph had an issue with the way I use certain words in terms of a in terms of a North American context that didn't translate to a Trinidadian context, and I had to change it for a Canadian audience. Even though when I went to Trinidad to do my interviews, the wording I used and everything was basically the way that the locals were speaking, right? So it's kind of, and Sara, I see you like nodding. It really is an issue that ethics, especially at a university, has. And also ethics working, or sorry, not university ethics, but the hospital ethics that I had to deal with when I was working at the Ottawa Hospital. A lot of cases, the population that I was working with in terms of low income and homeless folks, the ethics board would require us to, especially because of COVID, it would require us to get like an address and phone number of people for contact tracing purposes. Homeless people don't have an address or a cell phone sometimes. So there was no way of me contacting them, which kind of made parts of the research we did not happen at first because we couldn't get that clearance. So like, even though I am advocating for like having a good relationship and adhering to the ethics, there are some gaps there. And I think identifying the gaps there is its own learning experience. So it's kind of like being on the inside, you kind of need to know how to navigate that. Also, a thing that I did in my master's too was that I took methods courses outside of my discipline. So like I mentioned, I was an anthropology student at the University of Guelph doing my master's, and I took a methods class in environmental science. And what it did for me in terms of my global health journey was learn more about how another discipline that is very connected to the broader scope of global health research navigates their ethics and navigates like what ethical research is. And from there, I found that in anthropology, we sort of have an emphasis on collecting accounts and transcripts and getting that thick, rich data. And it's in the coding process that we look for, that we do meaning building. However, in environmental science, in person and within that, within the sort of action of your methods, that's when you're looking for how well something has been, like programs have been implemented, or that's when you're looking at processes and everything. And it's after the fact in the coding process, you're looking at better connection to theory and that theories and frameworks and whatnot. So within understanding different types of ethics, so like within global health, environmental science, anthropology, even political science, you get to extrapolate how like where you do the meaning building versus where you do the evaluation, which is really interesting to me. Putting that to side, another thing that I did in terms of methods and ethics is that I participated in the CACID School of Activism and Advocacy. So CACID, for those of you that don't know, it's the Canadian Association for the Study of International Development. And I participated in a field school about 4 years ago. And here I got to learn about how NGOs and different organizations ensure that the work that they're doing is rooted in some form of activism and advocacy. And in particular, I did a placement at Nutrition International, their headquarters in Ottawa. And it was a great experience. It really pretty much solidified that I would go into nutrition and global health. But one thing that I learned is that for me, methods were inherent and completely tied to activism and advocacy, which is not necessarily something that all researchers identify with. And I would argue that I would say that, and kind of with the other question too, a lot of global health researchers may find that connection because you are engaging so much with different populations, and there is that inherent need and want to help advocate and to engage in advocacy. However, within a broader scope of public health, I find that that's kind of not the case. I remember in one of my methods classes at Waterloo, I submitted a question to the professor that was talked about as a discussion question with the class, being like asking what is the role of activism and advocacy in public health research. And she said in particular, I don't think that they're one of the same, that they are sort of separate. And do I disagree? Yes, but I did understand where she was coming from, because in different fields, you might have to ensure that separation in order to ensure like valid or replicable research or reputable research. I would argue in global health research, that's not the case. You have to sort of be an advocate. You have to engage in some sort of activism in order to ensure there's an ethical orientation towards the work that you're doing. So, yeah.
Well, thank you. That was a lot of food for thought, actually. Stuff I didn't realize, and courses that you can take as well. The CACID was interesting. I'm definitely going to check that out myself, because that's an interesting and very good resource you mentioned. I'll pass it on to Sara now, and we actually did have another person join us, Danica. Thank you. So Sara, do you want to give us your take on the question?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I had to laugh at what you were talking about in terms of formal research ethics. That was sort of the first point in my list of things to talk about too, because yeah, like I agree with you. I think that they're obviously like really important. And what I found really helpful about the ethics approval process was just they asked me a bunch of questions to make sure I had thought about them. And I think that's really important. I guess I sort of looked at it that way. It's like, this isn't, they're not like policing me. They're trusting that I'm doing ethical research, but they're there to support and remind me, okay, like, have you also thought about this aspect of the process, so that I don't have to, so that I don't forget anything, so I don't overlook anything. I found it helpful in that sense. But I also did find some aspects cumbersome and kind of clunky in the context of the research that I was doing. And yeah, I think the main thing for me was just like written consent forms. And I think there would have been a different way for me to go about that, because there's like, for example, I think in Indigenous communities, if you're doing research in Indigenous communities, there's like alternatives to written consent. And I think I could have explored those options a bit more in the context of rural communities in Honduras. But it's sort of standard procedure to do that written consent form. And my participants just found it very weird. It was like a really big mismatch in the context to present them with this very formal document and have them sign it at the end. Yeah, so some of those things felt weird, and it definitely felt like a disconnect. So I think there's room for growth there, I suppose. In terms of like my own approach, my own sort of methods for a sense of ethical research, I guess. For me, it's largely connected to having opportunities to live and work in the setting where I'm doing research, where I'm doing community engaged or international development support work. And so, yeah, in many ways it's a privilege to be able to do that, but I also think it's an important privilege to take advantage of, I guess. And so, yeah, when I was living in India, that was actually, it was a cultural exchange program. That's the intention of the program. And so opportunities to live with a host family and a focus on like, learning about, like, I was learning the language, and I think learning language is a great way to build bridges, and also a great way to, feel like a child again and stumble around not knowing how to do anything. It's very humbling. Yeah, but even simple things like I used to ask my host father to take me to the vegetable market with him, or the chicken butcher, like just normal everyday things, and having opportunities to do that in the context where I'm living and working. I think that I guess like my hope in doing those things, like when I was in Honduras too, I like joined the local gym, and I would work in cafes and get to know or attend like local festivals and get to know people. And I think in the context of the work that I do, especially because I have always worked in settings, in these settings where I've worked, I've been such an obvious foreigner, such an obvious outsider, and to take the time to like communicate to people in word and in deed that I'm interested in like the everyday things that are going on, and I want to get to know them in their real lives. So that's something that I sort of focus on and look for opportunities to do, to be able to spend a lengthy amount of time somewhere.
Yeah, it's wonderful.
So it starts to feel like home. In terms of like formal training, actually kind of similar to you, Chantal, I was thinking about anthropology courses that I've taken, research methods courses that I've taken. And then I also did sort of a field school. I think that like, I don't think anything can, you asked about, Katya, you asked about formal training versus sort of learn as you go.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that the sort of classroom research, or sorry, classroom learning is really important to lay the groundwork and yeah, get some really good insight and grounding in something. But I don't think anything can beat experiential education, which is why we do things like co-op programs, or why we do things like internships.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, and I think, so I did a field school that was focused on, basically it was asking the question of like, can experiential education be done ethically? Is it possible to do like a short-term volunteer trip in a way that is not harmful, or that is, we focused a lot on intercultural competency and and a lot of conversations about colonialism and privilege and power dynamics and so on and so forth. So that was really interesting opportunity as well. That was through the University of Guelph.
That's wonderful to hear. So it really seems like the academic stuff gives you that formal learning, but gives you like theories that you can apply to practice, and that's where most of the learning happens. That's what it seemed like to me. Correct me if I'm wrong. And just to, I guess, segue into the third question, I like how both of you mentioned the ethics research boards, how they were helpful sometimes, but they were also detrimental if your research sort of like was out of the scope of like stereotypical research that happens. So like if you use language that maybe a Western like a researcher wouldn't understand, but someone in the context of where you are would understand that. So I'm wondering, where do you believe change needs to be implemented to ensure that ethical practices are followed in global health research? This is a very big question, so there's no right or wrong answers. Chantal, I'll pass it on to you first.
Yeah, I spent a lot of time thinking about this, and it's a question that is, I'm of the fact that like questions like this should never ever have a right answer, because if we do arrive at one, then that's kind of like, that's it. No, but like the reality is what we see as ethical changes. It's dynamic, and like whether it be in research or like even in our everyday lives, like things change and context changes, and that matters. One example of where I saw, or an example of, I'll give you a personal example. So when I was in my master's, my advisor, Elizabeth Finnis, who's an anthropologist, was tapped by, I believe it was the Ontario Veterinary College. The Ontario Veterinary College at Guelph also includes population medicine. So she was tapped by a professor that had gotten funding for a PopMed project. And so they wanted her as an anthropologist sort of within that larger like CCGHR team to sort of help with like ethical things and whatnot. And I remember being with her during that first meeting. There's about 50 of us. And after every point someone made about this is how we're going to go into the communities, it was something looking at farming practices and implementing, or the use of waxes to put to like spray like a sort of edible wax on foods, fruit, to keep them like lasting longer and everything. I'm doing a terrible job of explaining, but you're putting it together. So basically, really great idea, really great project meant to preserve food, especially in hot climates. They last longer, all that good stuff. So after everything that was said about what collaboration with the farmers and like agriculturalists would look like in these, I think it was India and Pakistan, everything that was mentioned, Dr. Finnis would be like, we need to make sure there's a translator. We need to make sure like, you know, we're not just talking one-on-one. Maybe it's a group of farmers so they feel more comfortable. Like after everything that was said, she had something that no one else thought of. So it really showed the importance of how ethical practices can be ensured through multidisciplinary teams, because even having that one anthropologist there, I'm not going to count myself as an anthropologist, I was a baby anthropologist, doesn't matter. But like even having one anthropologist there really, like it was a group of 50 people, and these were things that they didn't consider, not because they're ignorant people, not because like they're brilliant scientists, but their training did not necessitate having to think about that stuff. And so that's why I feel like these teams are really, really important. That's one change that I could see, and I do see it happening within the global health scale. I think it could happen more, though. I think it really is missing, and that's something I'm like looking forward to like seeing change with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's something you actually mentioned at the very beginning, how, or at least something that I think of, like, one point of view is never a right point of view just because it's only one. So having those multidisciplinary teams is so critical. And just seeing it, more emphasis on this in undergraduate education, I love seeing this. So hopefully we're coming into a new era of research. And without talking a lot more, I'll pass it on to Sara, so you can answer the question as well.
Sure. I really like what you said, Chantal, and I fully agree. I kind of, my undergrad was an arts and science program, so it was like inherently interdisciplinary, and I've always found it interesting sort of interacting with people in different disciplines who've sort of like more purely gone through their own discipline, where I've been like dabbling around and been like, wow, like it is very different. It's a very different way of thinking, and they have like way more knowledge in their field than I do. But there's lots of things that, that weren't part of their training, and therefore aren't part of what they're thinking about. And I've always found it interesting to sort of like, dabble around and be like, oh, this is what these people think about. Interesting. This is what these people think about. In terms of my own thoughts on this question, I guess I was thinking more about how like individual researchers engage in their research. And I feel like sometimes in research, like we're concerned about objectivity, and it can make us kind of afraid to engage with one another, just like human to human. And I understand where that comes from, and I think that there are particular types of research and particular study designs where that makes a lot of sense. But when it comes to global health or any research relating to human health, we're often engaging with other humans on topics that are really personal. Like our physical health is very personal, our emotional and mental health, our spiritual health, like these are really intimate parts of our lives. And so I think that ethical global health research recognizes that and engages accordingly. So yeah, I'm just thinking about what else I wanted to say about that. I guess like I also recognize like I don't see myself as a pure academic. I definitely take a very practical approach to the work that I do. For me, it's sort of like I got into research because I saw it as an opportunity to play a role in what's going on in international development and play a role in what's going on in global health in a way that made sense based on my own positionality, my own skills, and also the things that I am not skilled in or not an expert in. So this is actually coming out of when I was working in India, coming in with like a degree in agriculture, but realizing very quickly that I don't know anything about the seasons here, and I don't know anything about the crops here because they're entirely different from what I have studied. It doesn't make sense for me to be an agricultural, person in this context because the staff members of this organization have lived and breathed, rural Indian agriculture since they were born. So yeah, in that sense, I got into research because I saw it as a tool that can be used for like program monitoring, for program evaluation in these sorts of settings. And for me, it's, I care about the communities first. And if research is a valuable tool, then let's use it. And let's use it, again, like if as global health researchers, if we're interested in developing and contributing to communities where people are flourishing, communities where people are experiencing health and well-being, communities where people are experiencing equity and justice, then we have to engage with individuals in those communities on that level, and on the level of what that means and looks like for them, and working together to those ends. So I think sometimes we miss out on that when we're trying to be like too removed, and too sort of like armchairy, if that's a word, armchairy in our research.
Oh, that makes sense. Yeah. So it really sounds like you're advocating for like a humanistic approach. Like these are actual people who you need to create a relationship with, who you need to get to know, and they need to get to know you as well to be able to trust you. So that's wonderful. And I also realized I didn't mention this. Layla, Shoshana, or Danica, if you guys ever have any questions that you have or anything you want to add, feel free to either type it into the chat, raise your hand, unmute yourself and talk. Always welcome to do that. So it's not just you're listening sort of thing. And with that, I'm actually going to move on to the next question while you guys can think about this. So for Chantal and Sara, have you guys noticed the colonial effects manifesting differently in field work compared to like literature, compared to research for like narrative or literature reviews? So does the question sort of make sense?
Yeah, I thought about this too, and again, with my background, I find that field work is a really, if it is the right researcher doing the field work under the right context, field work could be a really great tool to undo a history of colonialism, because it does ensure that the researcher and the community are sort of on the same page with things, if the relationship and the context is right. You know what I mean? So I think that's kind of on Sarah's point. Sara, you said something really interesting about if the research works, or like if the research is needed. And I think if those things are fulfilled, then that's an example of where fieldwork could do some really great things. In the discipline of global health, anthropology, sociology, we have seen the worst humanitarian crises emerge because of poorly planned fieldwork. And a lot of it is because a lot of researchers with sort of their like imperialist standards and ideas of and notions about what good health is and what civilization is, those things have really impacted the way that I would argue the West sees a lot of what we understand to be as like lower income places of the world, which is really unfortunate, because again, a critical lens in any sort of discipline nowadays would show that it's poor research. It's it's kind of like it's infalicizing, and it's problematic to say the least. So I think if fieldwork is prepared for in the right ways, collaborations and partnerships are worked on, and there are clear sort of goals and objectives of what the research is going to look like and what the research could help with or supplement, then that's a really great example of how you could sort of end that colonialist, those like sort of underpinnings manifesting the idea of research. In terms of literature reviews, I've only been part of like one beginning to end literature review. Otherwise, I've just kind of helped with like a coding process. But I find that in our capstone PhD class, we talked about realist literature reviews. So a realist literature review is done looking by the context of interventions, looking at the context of interventions and how they work or how they have not worked. And it's important in global health research, in my opinion, because it is looking at interventions and programs. I think, and it also calls on the people doing the literature review to be more critical of not just the article itself, but like looking at the findings and being like, you know, they're reporting positive findings, but it's really with a marginal population of the greater, a smaller population of the greater population that is mentioned in the study or something like that. So it's calling on a more critical eye of the researcher. It's also calling on looking at the interventions and whether or not they've worked. And it is an offshoot of systematic reviews, which I think is helpful as well, because systematic reviews are very well known. They're huge undertakings, but they are undertakings that are undertaken more so often. So if there is an opportunity to sort of decolonize literature reviews, I would argue that a realist synthesis is a really good way to do that. And I actually have 2 links that I'll just share in the chat if anyone is interested in learning more about that.
Yeah, that's actually wonderful. I've never heard of realist reviews before, and it seems like they incorporate a lot of the teachings that we are taught, sort of like to question where the data comes from, what's the population, and stuff like that. So that's wonderful to hear. I'll definitely give those a look. And I'll pass it on to Sarah if you don't have anything else to add, Chantal.
I'm good.
Perfect. Yeah, Sarah, what's your take on the literature or the review versus fieldwork sort of scope?
Things to add. I guess what I was thinking about, and maybe this is kind of an offshoot, but sort of further to what we've talked about in terms of like the purpose of research. I think that that's an important question. Like, how do we see the role of research in the work that we're doing? And again, like I mentioned, like I see it as a tool that's useful at times and in places. And particularly in the context of global health research, the intention is that it's a tool that is serving people well and is contributing to an expansion of health and well-being in various ways. So one of the things, and maybe this is actually going back to the previous question, but one of the things that I've noticed in my own work is there's just sometimes a challenge in terms of the time and resource constraints that make it difficult to do the type of research. Oh yeah, this is totally going back to the previous question, but it's
That's
all
okay.
in mind, so I'm gonna say it.
If you have more to add. Yeah,
to do research ethically, to do global health research ethically, to do it in the most participatory way that we want to do it, to do it in the most inclusive way that we want to do it, to like follow up, do something called member checking. So like following up with participants and making sure that we're understanding the data that they gave correctly or understanding their stories correctly. And that's something that I found really challenging, and I think would be really challenging particularly at the undergraduate and the master's level, just because the length of time that you're working on any individual project is so short. There isn't necessarily the time and resources to do all of that good work. But then more broadly, like I think in many ways academia isn't designed well for developing healthy long-term partnerships and maintaining them. I don't see a lot of ways that the academic community is supporting, encouraging, and sort of like incentivizing that. There are other sort of like short, quick output incentives that are stronger and more prominent. And so that's definitely something that I think needs a work over in terms of so I guess that would relate to fieldwork and the challenges of doing fieldwork well. And I don't know if I have a lot to say about lit reviews. I think that like I could, but I'm recognizing it's 11:51 and I don't want to go off the rails.
That's okay.
But yeah, overall, I guess I would add to that, sort of back to my sort of practical approach to research. Sometimes conversations about like authorship and where research is where knowledge is produced, how it's produced and managed, who has opportunities to publish, what languages are represented. Like those are all things that come up that you notice in lit reviews. And that's where I think strong community partnerships can play a role in terms of introducing new voices. That would go off the rails. I have too much to say about that. So
That's okay. You guys both gave quite a lot of information. Both of you actually reflected a few points that Dr. Rondu made regarding sort of like the authorship of papers and sort of like where the research comes from, and especially like there's one mention of how a lot of research done by Western people is made just for like just to put into like not just to increase the intellectual data that they have. It's not made to actually like be used for something. So that's something that I also see as needing to change. Like we need to change the goals and why we actually do research. Like Sarah, you mentioned that you always try to find like use research as a tool, and that's actually a really good analogy for what it should be used for. And you did mention that there's 7 minutes left now on my clock. So I was going to open up the floor to any questions that you guys may have. If not, I'll ask the very last one. Nope. Alrighty. Well, there's 2 left, but I'll answer the very, actually,
I had a question.
Oh, yes, sorry. Layla.
I just wanted to hear a bit more. I think it was, this is Chantelle. Maybe Sarah also touched on it, but I wanted to hear a bit more about like maybe examples of language and like how ethics review boards were saying that you couldn't use certain language. I was curious to hear like some examples of that.
Yeah, okay. So a little bit of context. My family's from Trinidad. So I grew up speaking and Trinidad's official language is English. So English and Spanish. So I grew up speaking English, but like with the Trinidadian sort of like accent a little bit and like the slang. So for example, in the first part of my interviews, I had to ask the question like, how old are you? Or like, and then I had to ask like, do you identify as a male or female? Ethics made me use that language, but in Trinidad, you never ask someone, how old are you? Just being like, you know what I mean? You'd be like, tell me your, you have to use like, tell me your age. Like you have to use more open language to sort of incite sort of like a conversation. And then male or female are not, you don't ask people, are you male or female? You say like, are you a guy or girl? And you have to be very, it's a culture where informal language is used as a sign of respect. Because when you use formalized languages, and I did my research in South Trinidad, which is kind of known to be a lower income area, using formal language is kind of saying like, I'm here, I'm educated, and you're not. So I had to be very, very mindful of that. And they call diabetes in Trinidad, they call it diabetes, but they use the word sugar. So like, for people I interviewed would be like, yeah, I have sugar. I've had sugar for like 12 years or something like that. And in my interview transcript or in my interview guide at first, I used the word sugar, and Guelph Ethics made me change it, which made sense because ethics needs to make sure that like, you know, the language is correct, but like in reality, it wasn't. So that's like another example there. I'm trying to think of other things. There are a lot of little ones in terms of like medication. Oh, in Trinidad, people personify their medication as gendered. So they would say like, I need to take, like, instead of like, my medication is working, they'll say she's working. So things like that, which is really interesting too. So it was hard to explain that to ethics because they wouldn't understand it. And it's only something that I know because I kind of grew up with it, even though I grew up in Canada. It's things I heard my grandparents and my parents saying. So those are a couple examples.
Interesting. Okay, I get it now.
Sarah, do you have anything to add from your experiences? Because that was a really good question. I was interested in that as well.
No, it just reminds me of many moments where I learned that a word that I thought I found that especially in India, just because there's like Indian English. So words that I was like, I know that word, but people are using it in a very confusing way. So that's what that reminds me of, is like learning those nuances.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you guys actually mentioned that because I have one experience totally not as grand as yours. However, I had to translate a Russian sort of interview into an English transcript. And the difference between the languages, the difference between the structure, the way that you portray different points is so different. And I feel like that's something we need to accept in the field of global health, that like different countries use languages differently. They have different symbolisms for what does a Western researcher mean coming in? what is the use of this language, such as Chantal, you said that the use of formal language was seen as sort of like looking down, I guess. So sort of like that.
Disrespectful, yeah.
Yeah, disrespectful. So that's really interesting that you mentioned that. And I feel like that's something really big in the field of global health that we need to start considering. Like not just the fact that someone's a different culture, but what does that actually mean?
I wanted to mention,
think,
oh, sorry.
Sorry, I was just going to add, like, I think that's why I so often see my role as like, you know, like bridge or storyteller, and it's sort of like, okay, if I'm going to be a person who's sort of in between places, and is learning how to communicate in both spheres, then like it's kind of, I guess I see it as kind of my role and responsibility then to navigate that. Like, how do I do that well? How do I figure out how to navigate, you know, Canadian research ethics so that this project can happen? Because it's important that this work happens, and it's important to the organization that I'm working with. So how do I navigate this world, but then also navigate the project itself so that it happens in a way that makes sense to the organization and that addresses the priorities and needs of the organization and fits within the context that they're working.
Great. And then last words from Chantal, because we are coming up to the 12 o'clock.
Yes, deadline. I'll be really quick. Sarah, you made a really great point about context, and it kind of one of the questions that was supposed to be asked was notable research skills. I highly suggest, even if you're a quantitative researcher, to do some sort of work in qualitative research, because context is so inherent. And I'm going to shout out Shoshana because she did a brilliant presentation about coding and context when we were in doing master's coursework, because it's so important to understand that context. And I personally believe for all researchers, doing like coding and sort of learning about different types of coding is a great way to learn the language, learn the culture, learn the like slang, like all that kind of stuff, because it really does help paint a better picture of what that global health reality is for the population that you're working with.
Wonderful. Yeah, I second that point. Once I took a qualitative methods course, changed my whole view on research. It's absolutely amazing. All right. And we are actually at 12 o'clock. So I'm just finding the participant guide so I can post it in here. And we are coming up to the poster presentations. So there's going to be different breakout rooms back in the large meeting room, and you guys can choose which breakout room you want to go with. The participant guide I just sent right here. You guys can open that up, see what's interesting. Thank you so much, Chantal and Sarah, for talking. It was a very amazing conversation, very informative. Yes, Danica, very informative. I learned a lot, and hopefully you guys enjoy the rest of the forum.
Thanks so much for organizing.
Thank you. Have a great rest of your day.
Take care, everyone.